So, as I say, we have a guest speaker who's about to kick off on the subject of chemical-free beekeeping.
Something, I've got a little sign that says it's recording. I don't know if you have.
Yes.
Yeah, we record everything.
Who records everything?
The government. MI6.
It's not.
Malden Council.
Is there a meeting that's happening? Carly's kicked off is there a council meeting?
Possibly. It sounded a bit council-y.
Yeah, I think they've gone quiet though, so maybe they've dropped off. Okay, shall we? Cognizant of the fact it's just gone 8 o'clock. Why don't we kick off with today's talk? So I'll hand over to John Haverson to lead us through this lecture on chemical-free beekeeping. John, over to you.
Thank you. I don't want to lecture any of you. I want to talk to you a little bit about chemical-free beekeeping.
Brilliant. Okay.
And how I've done it.
Okay, fabulous.
As I said to you earlier, David, some people might have missed it. I haven't used any treatments, any chemical or otherwise, for over 12 years. My winter losses are less than 10%. I get sufficient honey for my needs and to sell some to others. And I've got calm bees that live in the garden with us as well as other places. But,
okay.
So I'd just like to look at the history a little bit. When I started beekeeping was about 2000. And Varroa had been around in this country for the early 1900s, I reckon, and it had decimated colonies. And understandably, people went to use Apistan to try and suppress the Varroa. And at about 2003, Varroa was becoming resistant to Apistan. We were doing all sorts of things, washing the bees and counting the number of Varroa that were dropping off and all sorts. And we changed in the apiary that I belong to, which was Andover. We changed to using oxalic acid as a fumigant in the winter.
Yeah. Which
was quite dangerous for us. But I used it, and once I put it into, I fumigated the bees, and they let out an awful moan and then died. So treatment has to be very precise, and it might have been me, but it might be that the weather was quite cold. But what I've noticed over the years is that the Varroa resistance has been increasing, and there are more and more chemicals on the market for people to try, and the frequency of treatment has gone up from once in the autumn. It's now, people are telling me they treat 3 times a year in some places. And I've even got friends who are using 3 different chemicals in the season to stop the Varroa becoming used to them. But actually it's not making the Varroa any weaker. They're becoming immune to the chemicals. So for me, the arms race against Varroa was not working. And looking at various treatments, there are over 12 treatments now on the market, and they cost money. And the last time someone said they were costing £9 per treatment per hive. And the other thing is that they are polluting or contaminating the honey and the wax, the foundation in the hives. More importantly, these chemicals are actually damaging bees. They're not just killing Varroa, it is a pesticide, and they're damaging the bees, which is why they say you use oxalic acid in the winter when there's no brood, because it'll kill the brood. But of course there is brood around in the winter. They damage the queens, and they make the drones less fertile. And I've got a couple of papers one by Mullin in 2010 and another one by Johnson in 2010 that sort of prove these facts. Now, when I started, there weren't any swarms around and people were buying nuclei. But no one wanted to do the job in Andover, so I was swarm liaison officer for 10 years, and I got called out to help the public, often with swarms in the gardens or bees living in chimneys or roofs or their sheds. And I noticed that these bees were surviving. And the bees, the swarms that I managed to collect, I put in my hives. And I aim to try and reduce the stresses from me and try and understand what the bees need in order to survive, because they were surviving without my help. So what I'll do a little bit now is look at the difference between the conditions of a wild colony, a colony living wild, against managed conditions. In other words, natural stresses versus human stress applied to bees. Before I go on, I'll allow somebody to poke me in the chest if you want, or clarify what I've been saying.
From my point of view, I think this is fascinating. I've already been trying to do chemical free since I started because I know nothing else.
Okay.
And I've done some research online with, funny enough, American beekeepers who seem to be very strong in trying to find alternative methods of beekeeping.
Yeah.
And so I've been sticking sprigs of mint, thyme in, using essential oils and seeing the reaction from the little bees I got.
Yeah.
And so far so good. The ones that have been treated, so to speak, with essential oils and non-actual chemicals or kind of man-made chemicals seems to be very mellow, happy and staying around. And the other one seems to be a little bit agitated, that I had not had the same level of exposure as the others.
Can we cover that a bit more later, Francis?
Certainly. Sorry, I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's okay.
Yeah, John, I'd understood that people who use oxalic acid fumigation in the winter, the reason for the timing, I thought it was not that it harmed any larvae, but that there was very little brood, so that that would, under wax, if you like, that would protect the varroa, and that the only varroa there, or the vast majority of varroa that were present, would be on the adult bees that are in the brood.
Yeah, David, I don't want to start examining the efficacy of different treatments. As I say, the two papers I've mentioned actually go through how these chemicals damage the bees in a lot of detail.
Okay. Can you send? Is it possible if you could send I'd be very interested in reading that piece of research if it's available. Is it available on the public domain?
It was, but I've collected it from the web. So what I'll do is I'll send a copy over.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that too. Thank you.
I'll send it to the one email I've got, Sylvina.
That's fine. I'll circulate it.
Okay.
Thank
Now, if I look at the wild bees, the first question the first issue I have is shelter. And I've seen them building their nests in chimneys around the tube that goes up in the chimney. I've seen them in roof spaces and in walls, and all of these places seem to me to have some central heating from the habitation, the humans being there. Apart from the big trees, and the big trees that I've been asked to get bees from, especially when bees have been felled and someone said they're stinging us, can you come and take the bees away? But the trees have actually got wall thicknesses 3 to 4 inches thick and more, which gives them a lot of insulation. So the volume is usually smaller than an extending beehive, a telescoping beehive. And people like Tom Seeley talk about, 40 litres will attract bees, and you can give a bit more space, but you keep the entrances small. What I found works for swarms is something about a hole 25, 26 millimeters in diameter. They'll go in there, whereas they don't like an 18-inch long slot from a national hive.
Right.
The other thing is they're usually high up. A chimney's difficult to get to, and a roof is usually at least 4 meters up. The trees there 4 or 5. I have found some on the floor, on the ground, but they're high up where they can get seclusion, peace and quiet, minimum disturbance, where they can just maintain the nest conditions. And so why do they want to just keep their nest nice and quiet? Primarily, they're rearing brood, and they want to ideally keep the temperature at 35 degrees, and brood actually need humidity to keep them moist, especially sort of larvae. And a couple of scientists, Krauss and Velthius, did some work on Varroa, and they realized that temperatures above 35 and humidity, relative humidity above 79% will inhibit Varroa. It stops them breeding. So I thought, well, where do you get those sort of conditions? And actually, during a honey flow, when they're ripening off the nectar, they push the temperature up to 40 degrees, and the air becomes saturated with the excess water, and the bees will fan it out the entrance eventually. But there is a period when that those conditions are working against Varroa. So one of the other activities, or some of the other activities, there's lots of things going on in the nest, but the key ones for me in this talk are hygienic behavior. And this is the fundamental to honeybees' health, is that they can turn over their brood quickly. Anything that's not right, that's ill, they chuck it out, and then they just the queen lays some more, and they bring up more brood. So there's this constant flushing out of the brood nest. But in order to do that, the bees need to detect damaged brood in the cells, whether it's a larva or whether it's a pupa, and if it's been damaged by Varroa, they can detect it. Now, how they do it, it might be smell, and if something's dying, let's whip it out and chuck it out. Or it might not be moving, rather like our own babies. If they stop kicking around in the womb, there's something wrong. So the bees pull them out and they chuck them out the entrance. And the thing about chemicals, if you see things coming out of the entrance that look like they're damaged bees, and you think, oh, well, there's a Varroa problem, and you start chucking chemicals in the hive, you totally destroy that hygienic circuit, because they're unable to detect, they're unable to smell. You're destroying that that pheromone, if you like, the pheromones. And the other thing about wild nests is they seem to enclose the brood area, or the whole nest really, with propolis. They seal the whole thing up. And I know beekeepers hate propolis, but the fact is that the propolis is protective. It seals up their nest. It's Professor Marla Spivak in America, she majors on propolis as part of the immune system of the superorganism. So not only do bees have a bit of immune system, but the whole lot is sealed in with this antiseptic resin. It's a gum that's made with resins, and it's made with things that the bees put in as well. Interestingly, it allows water vapor to go one way, but not water the other way. So when you see the inside of tree trunks absolutely coated in it, it's another barrier around, and it's protecting the womb. I say the womb, the brood nest. That's the way I look at it anyway. Now, so you've got this three-dimensional array of pheromones in which the bees are doing all sorts of things. There's honey coming in, there's nectar coming in, there's pollen coming in, and the bees are actually processing that as part of the thing. And they're working in the dark. So they're doing, it's all about pheromones, and anything that disrupts the pheromones will disrupt the efficiency of their work. Now, one of the things about high humidity is it's water vapor. And I know beekeepers don't like condensation because it goes moldy in the winter. But these tree trunks and these other places have well-insulated natural cavities with wood, straw, something like that. And they keep the temperature up. And providing the temperature doesn't fall below 10 degrees centigrade, the water vapor will not condense. So it's a rather like in a sauna. If you're in a sauna, you keep the temperature up, you can have 100% humidity, and you know, it gets quite sweaty, and it's what you want to do. So it's that balance of, we want the humidity, we know it's doing us good, but we've got to keep the temperature up. I hope I'm starting to ping things in your minds. Another thing with the hygiene, in the nest, in a wild nest, you find all sorts of microfauna. There's woodlice, there's earwigs, there's various mites. Going even smaller, there's bacteria, there's beneficial bacteria, lactobacillus, and a dose of chemicals will kill all that lot. But those things are actually working as part of the nest environment, if you like. A brief word on comb. The bees make the comb from their own bodies, as you all know. They've got 8 wax glands, and they communicate on it. And part of that communication is the pheromones, as I said, with the especially on the dance floor when they're passing around the smell of pollens and nectars. But the foundation that we use from recycled wax contains chemicals from all sorts of beekeepers, and especially the, what do I call it, the second-class foundation that you can buy, the brown stuff. That comes in from countries like China and other places where they're a bit indiscriminate about the chemicals that they use. And there's some nasty organophosphates and antibiotics that have been used in China. But there's a whole list of countries that contribute to that. So the premier stuff is a bit cleaner. It comes from England, it comes from Australia, and it comes from Ireland. But and I have to say that Ireland have got an actual they've got a growing body of treatment-free beekeepers. So you can either, for my mind, you could either use starter strips on frames, or you could do it-yourself foundation. A lot of associations have got a foundation making press, or I don't know if yours has, or a device where you can get a plastic thing with the pattern of a foundation. You can just brush hot wax on it, and you can lift off your own foundation, made from wax from your own beehives, so you know exactly what's gone in it. How are we so far?
Yeah.
Still with me? Totally stunned? Totally against me?
Fascinating.
So I'm just trying to prick your consciences, really. The other aspect is nutrition and sustenance. In the wild ones, I mean, quality food leads to quality brood and quality bees, and they need variety. And so you need to consider colony density and available forage. And I was told recently about London. They've got so many beekeepers in London. They've got so many bees that the forage is a bit limited, and they've now got a problem with foul brood. So what's happening? Are they running short of nectar? I think they probably are. There must be 3 or 4 times as many colonies there as there were 15 years ago. And people are supplementing with sugar. And sugar is, as my wife says, you know, would you bring your kids up on crisps and Coke? And the answer is no. Now, staying with this sort of honey, ideally, you want to use honey, sustain them on honey. But the quantity required over winter varies. I use a warmer hive. I'm not going to tell you what sort, but it uses half as much as a national to go through the winter. And I've got a friend called Torben Schiffer who works with a guy called Tautz, Jürgen Tautz, who wrote Biology of the Superorganism. Some of you may know of him. And he's done some work with a hollow tree hive with sort of 4-inch thick walls. And he reckons they go through the winter on 2 kilograms of honey. He's weighed them before and after. So it's a bit like having your own house well insulated. You're not going to have to burn lots of energy to try and keep it warm. So there's this balance between how much ventilation do you give it, how much insulation. You know, you've got parameters to balance. It's not just a matter of not using chemicals and carrying on as before. Now, I'm going to mention sugar because sugar is a chemical. It's different. It has a different acidity, a different pH, and very few constituents when you compare it with nectar and honey. So I've known it to produce nosema if you feed something constantly on sugar over the winter. But there we go. And the other thing about sugar, years ago, when someone said to me I had to feed, you know, a bucket full of sugar in the winter, I put some cochineal dye in it, which we don't use now because that's crushing beetles. But I noticed that the bees may well have used it during the winter, but in the spring, the supers turned pink. So the bees were saying, we don't like this stuff. We're going to feed our young brood on new nectar. And they just put the sugar up in the super. So I thought, okay, again, another thing that made me think. Right. So far, so good.
Yep. Yeah.
Anybody asleep?
No.
I got lots of blank screens here. Nobody to talk to. Jane and Leslie and Maria and Stephanie and Steve and Neil and you're all there listening, are you? Yeah. Good to see you. Good to see you. Only right. I'm going to talk a bit about swarming because my success was really about collecting swarms and putting them in my hives. I was trained as a conventional beekeeper, and I do remember doing artificial swarming and hunting around for queens and putting them in different bits and shuffling hives from one side to the other. But it was quite troubling for the bees. I started to look into natural reproduction, which is swarming. And it's done to rejuvenate the queens, to spread genes. And these genes are important because in nature, the wild colonies have got to adapt to their conditions in order to survive. So they're looking for adaptability, they're looking for hygienic expression and productivity. Now, this is aimed at the blokes, really. You know that if you're lucky enough to have a wife, she's probably far more hygienic than you are.
I thought you were going to say about being productive then.
well, I have to say my wife is you know, she's able to detect things that need cleaning far before, you know, and tidying up before I've even noticed. So these genes do change. Now, as part of this natural reproduction, scientists have shown that the bees select the queens that they want. And I've got a paper that was produced in 2020, this year. And if I can read it out, it's a bit technical, but it's the epigenomic development system. This is all about developing your genes, is compromised by the development stress inherent in contemporary apicultural methods of queen rearing. Right. And another paper, which was 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 papers. Honeybee colonies regulate queen reproductive traits by controlling which queens survive to adulthood. And they reckon that queens are developed from eggs and larvae that come from particular patrilines. We know that queens will mate with, we're told, 12 to 20, but it could be even more than that. But somehow they're able to detect the eggs or the larvae that will produce the best queens. And these scientists have been doing trials, and they've been taking eggs, they've been taking larvae at 1 day old, 2 days old, and saying, well, we normally give them, beekeepers will normally graft them at 2 days old if they can get them, but that's not producing a top quality queen. And any time I've in the past, well, long time in the past, when I had a queen fail and I went and bought a queen and put a queen inside my hive, they're usually superseded after 2 months. You stick a mark on it and check through it and all the rest of it, and go back there and say, where's the queen with the mark? And you find a queen with no mark. So they've said, we don't like this queen, and they wanted to produce their own. But it's a stress. It's a stress on the bees. The other thing about natural swarming is an immunity, and in this case, a resistance to varroa. The genes that are resistant to varroa are passed from mother to daughter, and also to her sons. So if you've got a queen who has got a hygienic trait and she's surviving with no treatments, then her virgin queens and her drones are valuable. And those drones, they want to flood the environment. And wild colonies have between 70 and 20% of the colony as drones at the key swarm time, when they want to get out there and mate with other virgin queens. So it's critical. They're not, they're not being culled by beekeepers because they're a varroa trap. In the past, whenever I've culled 400 drone brood, I've perhaps found 2 varroa. It's not worth it. It's an awful loss of resource, and it means that if you're culling drones, you're emasculating the colony, and the colony just goes out and builds some more. But it's wasting effort. It's it's, as my wife says, it's like killing your boy children. So, but I accept that reproduction is stressful and it will test a colony's ability to survive. But we do help it. We give them a box to go into. We give them some shelter, and if they really need it, they get a bit of honey to just get them going if the weather's bad. I don't agree with putting a couple of gallons of sugar syrup on top of a new swarm, because it's just going to create poor quality brood. We're still there.
Yep.
We are.
The other thing about wild colonies, if they're weak and stressed, they die. But what that means is the wider community will survive and be stronger. And the effect of poor weather tests the bees. Wasps, I've noticed wasps will always test the bees, and wasps will always indicate your weak colony first. Close the entrance down, do what you like, but if the colony's not strong, the wasps will get in. And a weak colony will also, you'll also find that it may not be very good at foraging. It may not produce its own food. And likewise, you find colonies that don't cope with varroa or pathogens. And you do get them fail, the queens fail from time to time. But we're back to this natural disease control and this rapid turnover of bees, ejecting and flushing out the brood nest. And Bailey, some of you may know of Leslie Bailey, who was at Rothamsted in the 60s. Anybody remember that name?
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a guy called Les Crowder, who used to be a bee inspector in America, who tried infecting two of his beehives with American foul brood, and the bees were strong and they just cleared it out. But I've got a number of stories to tell about.
Hello.
Hello, lost your voice.
I'm here.
Oh, that's right, back
Okay.
again.
Didn't hear you for a short while.
I was breathing in. So the other thing about wild colonies, they tend to be spaced out. Work that Seeley's done said they can be on average 300 meters apart, or even a kilometer apart, but they are spaced out. And one of this thing about the transmission, the natural transmission of pathogens, is two ways really. One is by swarming, where some of the pathogens go on the swarm and they get carried on the back. So let's stay with varroa. They get carried on the back and to the new site. And the other is what they call horizontal, where it's done by robbing and transferring and drifting and all of that stuff. If you've got colonies close together, then they will drift, and you will find that any pathogen will get stronger. What also happens in a swarm situation is you get a brood break. Can anyone tell me how long it is in the mother colony when the queen disappears?
Why did she disappear?
A month?
8 days. Yeah, 28 days.
It's about a month, yeah. So there's no brood there. The bees are hatching out. Varroa's got nowhere to go. They could get groomed and stuff, but basically they're being heavily disrupted. And likewise, when they're building the new nest, the new swarm is developing comb. It's warming things up, building the comb. So it's producing conditions. It hasn't actually produced a lot of brood, but it's got conditions that are going to inhibit the production of varroa a bit. So wide spacing. Now, when we're talking about horizontal transmission between high densities of colonies, I suppose I've got to throw in the question about what do you consider is important about the transfer of brood frames and equipment between colonies?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the bee inspector came around and inspected my stuff, and he made a point of actually washing his hive tool and everything between every hive, a bucket of disinfectant. And then I went along to apiary meetings, and there were half a dozen people around various hives, and they're all dipping their hive tools in and levering out frames and things, and well, and there were dead bees around as well that were all being squashed and releasing entrails and pheromones and all the rest of it. Right. I've got another disease control thing that's come up. This is an aside really, because while my bees were sampled, they said you have got far less of the pathogens than managed colonies, apart from deformed wing virus, every one of your colony has got 96% deformed wing virus. But then they discovered that there were 3 types of deformed wing virus. There was type A, type B, and type C. And mine were all type B, which was beneficial. The other 2 are pathogenic. And when I spoke to the virologist who was doing this work, he said it's a bit like, he called it a superinfection immunization. He said it's a bit like cowpox and smallpox. If you get cowpox, you aren't going to get smallpox. And all your bees have got the equivalent of cowpox, which they developed naturally. I'm going to pause now. Have a little drink and let you have a think.
John, one question. When you say that, I think you said sometimes you feed your, if they are running short of stores, you feed honey.
Yeah.
Is that honey that you have harvested and then set aside specifically for this purpose? So you keep it on the, on the supers and either freeze it or just keep it,
Well,
somewhere.
Yeah, well, we like to eat honeycomb, and we don't use foundation, so it's free comb, whatever. But anything that's dark, and we also use post-brood comb, which has got pollen and propolis in it, and we press that, so it comes out relatively dark. It's got an awful lot of pollen in it. It's got multiple factors of pollen, and 3 people running the same sort of hive had their samples of honey tested in Cardiff University in about 2015, where 250 samples were sent in by beekeepers. These 3 samples of honey had antibacterial properties as strong as Manuka honey. So what was your question again?
No, where
Of course.
feeding the honey to?
So because we keep our honey in comb form, we're able, if we need to give a colony that's a bit light in the spring, a pound or 2 of comb honey, which is the equivalent of fondant stuck on top. And we give it in a small, tiny little super, and the bees use it because they have to, and then they refill it and give us a small thing back with honey in it, honeycomb in it. If we get a swarm and the weather turns bad and it can't get out and forage, we feed it about a pound of honey, slightly watered down, in a small feeder, which you can empty, about a 500 cc feeder, which you can empty overnight, because we've discovered that allowing it to do that means it gets re-energized, and in the morning they're off foraging.
Okay.
Whereas if we put too much sugar on it, and we've tried sugar, sometimes they'll stay there and they won't bother going out foraging, and other times they won't take it. Once they've tasted honey, they won't take sugar, and it'll just go moldy on top of the hive. So we've reduced it to a pound of honey, and we keep jars of honey spare for the family, but also for the bees.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, it's important. I guess it's important point is you're not giving them honey that you bought in a shop or anything. It's honey that they've produced.
No, the honey that you can buy for £1 in the shop are probably coming from China. Via South America.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question I got is that I've only started off with two small colonies, one very kindly from the other John that he gave me as a split from one of his hide, and the other one was a potentially unfortuitous small swarm gathered from an ivy bush some distance away. Now, the problem with those two issues is that they're obviously not very large colonies. If they make it over the winter, then I'll give them all credit where credit's due. But I don't have the honey resources from existing hives to be able to provide.
Okay.
So I'm stuck with giving them sugar syrup with additives.
We'll come back to that. Come back
Thank
to
you.
that because there's at least 12 people in front of me. Steve, question.
Thank you. I was following your remarks on swarming, and the theory is very good, but are you suggesting we don't do swarm prevention measures?
That's something for you to decide. I don't do swarm prevention measures, but I do collect swarms. I have places in my garden where swarms will always land, and I also use bait hives. So the hives are set up, so if the swarms are looking for somewhere to go, they'll go in, and they don't always go, they aren't always from my bees, they come in from outside. So I'm getting, what I want to do now is run through a few points on how you might go treatment free, no chemicals or manipulations to try and improve your bees and get you off the chemicals, but still, you know, it's getting a balance right. Because when I started, there were 3 guys doing swarm control, 2 friends and I, and we swapped swarms around because we didn't always have enough boxes, so we got them from somewhere else. And now we've grown, and we pass surplus swarms or bees to other people. Some people have got bees where they don't, their neighbours may not want them to swarm. So they do simple splits, Steve. They don't do, if I could put it simply, if you had a double national brood box in the middle, at the beginning of swarm season in sort of April or something, when they're getting really feisty, you could split them in half, just horizontally, and put them on. Now, one's going to have the queen and the other one's going to have queen cells. And they will develop into 2 colonies without going through the colonies and all the rest of it. Are you still all right, David?
Yeah, I'm fine.
So let me just go through this approach, if you like. First thing is, what are your beekeeping goals? You need to examine those yourself. Don't listen to me, because I have beekeeping goals. Are you about conservation? Are you about chemical-free honey? Or are you about a maximum honey crop? And it doesn't matter whether you've got chemicals and excess sugar in it. Do you want calm bees?
Yeah.
Because if you're not into them every week, the bees are going to be calm. And they're far less work. And you also spend less money. I'm 20 years on, still in the same bee suit I bought 20 years ago. I only wear it once a year when I harvest honey. So those things to consider. And I'm happy to give this list to Sylvina if she wants to, use it as an aid memoir.
I'll do that.
The other thing is, what risks are you prepared to take? Think about what you might lose, because everyone says, oh, I'm going to lose all my bees. What did those bees cost you? Was it a commercial nuke, exorbitant fees, or did you manage to get a wild swarm or a split from one of your mates? One of the other things someone said to me, oh, this way of keeping bees is boring because all you do is watch them and look at the entrance to see what's going on. But I'm not getting into my bees every Saturday up to my elbows in the brood and stuff looking for the queen. That's what his goal was. Okay, so this is what I'm saying about you need to think about what's important to you. I'm not telling you which you've got to do. And if you want to go this way, can you adjust your husbandry? Are you prepared to? Right, my first point is use compact, well-insulated hives that are well dispersed. Stick them in people's gardens. If you're not interfering with them, they're usually calm and quiet. Thorns are actually marketing cork sheets, which you can strap around a National to make it better. And the National actually was designed early on to have a quilt in the winter, an empty super full of leaves to keep it warm. So back to this warmth and this humidity and whether you're going to get condensation. Right, the next point is use local bees adapted to your area and forage. Don't import them. Don't ask me for a swarm of Varroa resistant bees, because Essex is completely different from Hampshire in terms of its forage and weather, because it's cold over there. Collect swarms or use simple splits from survivor colonies. So you're not selecting for productivity. You're not saying that particular colony. You're saying all colonies, if they survive, we will allow them to swarm, or we'll do splits. Don't get a swarm. Don't get a new swarm and say first thing we've got to do is dunk it in Apistan. That's disastrous. If it's a swarm, it's usually free, or not many pounds anyway. Allow the natural selection of queens. Let them do it. Don't use artificially produced queens. Allow and promote drone production for open mating. And in some case, if you're using foundation, and clearly people do, leave a frame with just a starter strip, and the bees will build complete drone comb. They'll build, one of the frames will be totally drone comb. They need the drones, and it's worth doing that for them. Minimize a hive opening to conserve nest atmosphere. Wild bees will go in and out of a nest, which is about that big, quite happily. But we put a big long strip, big hole at the bottom, because we think they need to get in and out quicker. They'll conserve their heat, and they will manage their atmosphere better. Minimize hive opening to conserve the nest atmosphere. Opening it up and shaking them around, and as someone said to me, reassembling the furniture and squashing the kids is not good for their humor. Look for signs of hygienic behavior at the entrance, especially in the spring when they're starting to produce new brood, and they'll be chucking out larvae, and sometimes you'll find them with Varroa attached, and they'll be chucking out pupa, often drone pupa, and some with deformed wing virus or deformed wings. But basically that's showing that they're actually throwing stuff out. Don't prop up weak colonies. And this, cull them as necessary. If you've got a queen failure, and you may not look at it every week, but if you decide that it's not flying at the same pace as the other colonies in your garden or your apiary, then have a look at it. But if it has failed its queen, then you might as well cull it, except the bees are going to die. Because even if you've got a new queen, even if somebody says, oh, I'll give you a frame of brood, it's got some eggs in it. Those eggs have got to hatch. They've got to be turned into an emergency queen, and they may not be the right larvae. And that's going to take at least 21 days to produce a queen. That queen's then not going to be productive until she's mated. So it's another week, effectively. And then her brood is not going to start hatching out until another 3 weeks later. So we've gone about 2 months, at which time your bees in that hive have got really old. So you're not actually helping them. Far better to chuck them out into the hedge and let them find another hive. Sounds a bit hard, but it works. Avoid the transfer of brood frames and mixing equipment, supers and things like that. Ensure the quality of honey and pollen nutrition. Don't take too much honey. talking to Tom Seeley. Do people know about Professor Tom Seeley? Wrote some really good books. He was saying, you know, if you let the bees fill a brood box and 2 supers, and you only take 1 super, then you're not overworking the bees. You're taking, well, for us, it's going to be about 20 pounds of honey in a super, but you'll leave the bees with plenty. Now, this is the other thing. Stay local. Don't think you can go and get yourself a hygienic bee from the Swindon, Ron Hoskins in Swindon, because his bees don't always travel. He did give some to Plymouth to do this work on deformed wing virus, and they died. Wrong climate, wrong forage, a move, lots of stresses. So stay local, build up together. If you can work in a group, it's even better. In Andover, where my association is, there's 10 of us who work together. We swap our swarms and things, and we're treatment free. Not everybody in the association wants to do that. They've got other goals, you know, they want to do other things. But if you work in a group, even if it's a small group, and you cooperate with each other, and you swap surplus swarms or splits, then you'll cover each other's losses, and you will have too many bees. Stunned silence.
I just live in hopes of that last comment.
Well, I started this with these 3 guys in Andover, and we spread, and I was allowed to give the odd talk in the association, and people were coming up to me in 1s and 2s and 3s and saying, how do you do this? Can we do a bit of this with you? And I now facilitate. I won't say I'm in charge. I just facilitate a group of beekeepers doing the same thing in Hampshire, and there are 93 people in our group. We're dotted about. We've got some people from Wiltshire and some from Sussex, and you know, some from Oxfordshire, but and a few from Dorset. But they're working in little groups, 5 or 6 people around a town, and they're doing it, and they're just putting up their bait hives, and the bees are moving in, and they you know, the first thing you see on the forum is they just, oh, I've just had a swarm's just moved into my hive, fantastic. Or someone else says, I got given a swarm, so I ran it into my hive. It ran around for a bit and then flew off the next day. So it's back to, do the bees like it? And we'll, you know, so, and one of the things that they like the smell of is propolis and hives that bees have lived in, you know, something like that. So I'm going to just go back to Francis, actually, because he was asking about these little colonies. What we've found is that if you get a small colony and you keep it in a small space, end of the year, you know, a late swarm or something, if you keep it warm and we wrap it up with insulation, and some of us are using this wool cool stuff that you can get meat products delivered to you. It's sort of like plastic bag with wool in it, with little holes to allow ventilation. If you wrap up the hive warm, and you keep it warm and top and whatever, and you give them the minimum amount of honey, and I'm sure if you're working in a group, you can always scrounge a pound of honey on the basis that you'll give it back later. We find they come through the winter quite happily, these little colonies, and they build up, and then they swarm, or they just grow bigger. Should they fail, you, in the winter, all you have to do in the spring is sort of clean them up a little bit and leave some of the comb there as a bait for a new swarm. So it's, you know, the swarm's moving in, it's already got some freshly built comb that's come from the little swarm that went before them. So it's actually, but that's the way nature works. So it's almost as though they're investing in failure. The colonies are, the late swarms are producing the comb, they're dying out, but then the next swarm, the strong spring swarm from another colony is going to move in. So you're actually working as a community of honeybees. You know, honeybees in the environment all work together. It's you know, and we could do the same if we weren't so, oh, what's the word? I'm a bit selfish as well, but when you see it work, it's great, it's fantastic. And then the people who are prepared to pass things around and swap. But then as a group, we're actually into growing flowers as well. So you know, it's much more about the forage. Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, I've been keeping bees for about 7 years. I've had the same maternal line.
Yeah.
I've never put any chemicals in my hives,
Yeah.
but I am one of those who likes to watch the bees on the landing board.
Yeah.
And I take what honey I can. I've got 2 questions.
Yeah.
I'm not taking honey till the spring now. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
So I have 2 supers on my hives. And this year I was absolutely, I know it was a very good year, but I was absolutely overwhelmed with my bees. I did a split and then the split swarmed after I'd done it. And the second thing is, this year I've noticed, particularly on the landing board, a carpet of bees grooming each other. I watch the bees coming in and I think, oh my goodness, they're attacking that bee that's coming in. When I look a bit closer, I can see that they're grooming on the landing board, and there are examples of this on YouTube. I mean, do you ever see that?
Yeah. I spend all my time looking at the activity, and that grooming is also part of, if you toss bees out. I have in the past had a colony die on me, and I've thrown the bees into the hedge, and I've watched them all go to another hive, and the receiving hive has actually stopped all the bees coming in, and they've been doing this guard bee grooming type assessment.
Yes.
And after a day, they had rejected most of those bees. So what was wrong with them? I don't know, but they didn't want them.
I had 3, yeah.
At other times you can see a weak colony. You can just be watching them, and they will be working, but you'll know they're not as vigorous as another one. And we've seen swarms coming along and having a sniff around, and the swarms have actually usurped the hive.
Mm.
So you know, so these things will happen. But the thing about taking the honey in the spring, timing. So in May we get really strong flow around here, April, May.
Yes.
Presumably you're the same.
Yes.
But then it seems to stop, you know, that main honey flow stops for a bit before the blackberry kicks in. But at that point, the bees seem to have a rest. And that's a brood break, because they stop rearing brood. They say, look, we've got loads of brood. We've been building up really fast during spring. We've got all this honey, we've got all of this stuff. We're either going to swarm or we're not going to swarm. And if they don't swarm, they stop. If you take all their honey off them, have they got enough if they continue raising brood later in the summer, because they need that nutrition? And the other aspect is, if you replace it with sugar syrup, they have to convert that syrup into a pseudo honey, which is more work, and then they'll be feeding their brood on the syrup. So because it's still syrupy, it's not being converted into honey, it's still in that sort of liquidy form that they could use to feed. So there's a risk that they'll be using syrup on the brood. So I prefer to take the honey off in the autumn, when the nesters, you know, in September time, when the nesters really contracted, and you can work out how much honey they've got on the hive, and you can then work out how much they need for the winter. Now, I know they say with the standard national, you need 40 pounds of honey. Some of the hives I'm running are Warray, and you only need half that. and I leave them more than that. And there have been times when I've had a weak colony and it's only had 2 or 3 kilos of honey in it, and I've just wrapped it up warm, you know, blankets and all sort of things, and said, well, that's all you've got. You're late, you're small, I'll give you that, and if you survive, it's you know, it's good. But I don't feed it and feed it and feed it, because it's this, not everybody is strong, not everybody's weak, and what you're trying to do with your bees is actually improve your bees in terms of their survivability, their adaptability, or I am. Depends what your goal is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just you know, something to think about if you want.
Yeah.
So, any other burning issues?
I've got a question with regard to, there's a lot of papers and examples of essential oils being used to help with reducing wax moth, varroa, and other kind of parasites, and also to do with bee health in the gut and controlling nosema. What's your take on that?
Thymol,
Yeah, that's one of them. Yeah.
is one of the worst treatments you can give to a colony, and Johnson will explain why when I'm going to send the Johnson paper, a copy of the Johnson paper, on to Sylvina. Yeah, you're still there. You're still there. And,
I'm still
and
here.
I also I'll send you my little aid memoir. But what I noticed is in the garden we grow rhubarb, but we're not. If I can stop my wife from picking all the young shoots, occasionally we allow some to go to seed. And I've watched the honeybees foraging for the pollen on the rhubarb flowers. And I'm assuming there's as much oxalic acid in a flower as there is in the leaf. So they're collecting what they need to do the job. And every bit of pollen, the wide variety of pollens that you see see them collecting, has all got a different pharmacological quality. Like roses will have vitamin C, lavender will have something else calming, willow will have salicylic acid, which is one of the constituents of aspirin. So they're collecting all this and they're sticking it away in their hive, and it's their pharmacy. They'll go to it when they want to. So as for controlling wax moth is actually part of the part of that environment within the nest. As I was saying, you at the bottom of the nest where all the debris drops down, you're going to get you're going to get wood lice, you're going to get mites, you're going to get all sorts of things eating the debris, eating at the debris, and eating the mites as well. Wax moth tend to be, in the hives I use, they tend to be corralled at the top, under a top cloth. I use a top cloth rather than a crown board. And they get corralled in there between the cloth and the top bars, the frames. And it's almost as though the bees are keeping them there until they want them. But if you're running, I don't run mesh floors because they're too cold, but I have seen mesh floors where people have not bothered to clean them out underneath. They've had a board and it's got all the debris in it, and the wax moth get in there and they proliferate, and they invaded the nest because while they were small, the bees weren't able to control them. And one of the Project Revive comments that Professor Steve Martin said was that when bees are doing their hygienic thing and they're detecting something wrong with a cell, and then they're uncapping it, checking what's inside it, and if it's nasty, they chuck it out and relay it, or clean it out and relay it. If it's all right, they just cap it up again. But if it's a wax moth, they can pull it out and chuck it out as well. So the bees are capable of controlling this. They've been doing it for over 30 million years. but we try and help. Best thing we can do is give them a really well insulated, natural material hive, and give them lots of good forage around all year round. It's boring though.
No, it's better for the bees, though, isn't it? That's
It's-
the name of the game, isn't it? Apart from
Well,
if you're a honey gatherer.
yeah, but I find I can let my grandchildren sit around my beehives, watching the entrance and telling me what colour pollens are going in, without having to wear suits.
So what was that insulating material you mentioned earlier with the wool in the pack?
There's stuff called cool wool. Cool wool. If you ever get frozen meat, it comes in a pack and it's wrapped around with cool wool or Cool Max. But the other thing is, you can buy pressed cork sheets, 20 mil thick. They're brown and it's the cheapest, and they don't use any chemicals and stuff. And that's actually, I'm trying to think now, it's twice as good an insulation as cedar.
Wow.
So put a slab of that on the sides and around the top, and you suddenly find that you're creating a really warm environment. And the builders merchants have it. It comes in 20 mil or it comes in 40 mil thicknesses. As a group, we tend to buy a cubic meter or something and then split it up. But you won't want to do that just yet. Some people have used old duvets and they've wrapped them around and then put a layer of roofing, the roofing felt, the grey roofing felt that builders use. They just wrap them around with that, which sheds the water and it allows it to breathe. But everybody has their own ideas.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anyone burning to have all awake? Stephanie's there. Nice to
Well,
see
I just
you.
wondered about other essential oils that have been mentioned, like putting sprigs of mint and thyme in the base of the hive. Things like that, using spearmint. Tea tree was another thing that there was a paper on.
Yeah. They're all options.
To try it, and if they don't die, then it's obviously working.
Well, I even know someone who gets a rhubarb leaf and puts it on the floor of their hive, and says, and watches while the bees shred it and pull it out. So they're getting a dose of whatever. But I prefer to grow the flowers and see what they're going. They will go on rhubarb. I've seen them all foraging heavily on rhubarb, which I know has got.
Yeah, so both the ties over, both outsourced. But listening to you, I think there's a very strong chance they'll come home into the little garden, because if they're calm and happy, then they won't be a problem.
Steve,
Do you think there's any difference between the colony of wild bees and a colony of hive bees, insofar as we've been keeping bees in hives for 200 years? So presumably they've evolved to live in hives. Would that affect how you might treat them? You shouldn't really treat them as wild bees, or is that not correct?
you're trying to tell me that honeybees have been domesticated?
I'm asking, I'm not telling. I wouldn't presume that, John.
I would look at other domesticated animals like cows and dogs and things like that, and cows won't exist without man because they've become domesticated. Dogs likewise, some dogs. Cats are a little bit more feral. They can survive, but not all of them. It depends how well pampered they are. But honeybees, if you allow them to swarm into a hollow tree or something, and there are people actually putting up hollowed out logs now.
Yes. Yeah.
As part of rewilding things, and they hollow out a log and they give it 40 or 50 litres with 3-inch thick, 4-inch thick walls, and honeybees are moving in within a fortnight at swarm time, and they're all being filled. A chap called Matt Somerville has been pioneering that, and a lot of people are buying his hives, or they're actually going on his courses and learning how to hollow out a tree trunk. You know, if you've got a tree that's fallen over, then don't burn it, hollow it out and stick it up and watch, because I've been fascinated that every time we've done it, bees have moved in. They've gone round, the swarms have looked at it, they've sniffed it out, and they've moved in. And one of the guys I'm communicating with has got bees on his roof in Kew in London, near Kew, and he's got 5 colonies on top of his roof, and he's wrapped them all up in this Coolmax stuff. That's his insulation. But what he did, he tested this out on his balcony. He put some bait hives. He put some that were just ordinary 1-inch thick cedar, and he put others which were 1-inch thick cedar plus 2 inches of this wool, and the wool is twice as insulative as cedar. And he watched the scout bees coming in, and I don't know how they were able to do it, but they actually selected the insulated hives.
Yes.
So,
If the bees didn't like a hive,
yeah,
they are not kept in like cows or other domesticated animals. They can leave of their own free will. So in fact they do choose to stay in a hive, don't they? Even though they, it's an environment which they've become adapted to.
yeah. Some of them, I've known beekeepers use queen excluders to keep them in.
Yeah.
They'll run a swarm into a hive, and then they'll put a queen excluder under the floor to stop them coming out for 3 days.
Yeah.
But they so yeah, I've known them go into, I've put them into hives, and I've known them fly away as well.
Oh yes, yeah.
So yeah, they might become adapted to them, but if you stop treating them and stop feeding them copious amounts of whatever it is, you may find a different result. But I reckon bees are wild. They stay in our hives because we put them there. But when they fly, if they swarm, if a swarm, and let's face it, swarms in the wild have a 1 in 4 chance of surviving. But if they can survive and survive the winter, they can build a nest, provision it with food, and build up their strength, and then survive the winter and come out fighting in the spring. Yeah. They're back to wild again.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's been nice talking to you. I hope it hasn't all been one way. It's nice to have some questions as well.
Oh, it's been fascinating. Thank you very much.
It's been, yeah, very thought-provoking, I must say. I'm really, yeah, very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, John.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
I'll be in touch with these documents.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I look forward to part 2, John.
To part what?
Part 2.
Oh, there we are.
Well, we've got, as part of our sort of group thing, we have people living in Hertford, just up the road from you, isn't it?
Well, sort of.
And
The
northeast London. Do you know about?
Don't mix with that area.
There's a small holding called Organic Lee, where they grow vegetables and things.
Oh right, yeah.
And they actually, the guy who fronts that, he runs some organic bees. No treatment. I mean, it's organic. His whole thesis, his whole thing is about being organic, being as natural as possible. Yeah. Because he can't afford money on fertilizers and chemicals and pesticides and things like that. So,
okay.
So it's a different approach, and we are now. People are starting to think about the environment and how we can clean it up and get back to living as part of it.
Good.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yes, great.
Oh, is that the end?
The end. I should have had a sticker, shouldn't I? The end.
Be the same.
Thank you. Cheers.
Arrivederci. Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you.
No, it was
Thank you very
excellent.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
I'll be in touch,
Bye.
Sylvina.
Yes,
Bye.
John, if you could, I'll send you an email, but I just need how to transfer your fee to you. So and
Yeah.
might need details about your bank transfers and things like that.
Okay.
And Sylvia, we'll be passing on the information you get from John as well, please.
Yes, I certainly will. Once I've I'll pass it on to everybody. So the people that want it can look at it and the people that don't can ignore it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good
Okay.
night, then.
Good
Good
night.
night, everybody.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye then.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Oh, everybody's going now. Just you and me, John. Oh, Carly's there. Bye.